Thank you. My brief is to say a few words about the history of industrial strategy. And I want to begin by asking what is industrial strategy and how has it changed over time. I think the most common definition that immediately springs to mind is a set of policies towards industry, particularly manufacturing. However, since manufacturing has declined as a share of economic activity, this is no longer really going to be sufficient to improve the whole economic performance. And so I think really in the modern context we have to have a new definition, which is designing a set of policies to improve national economic performance, particularly compared to other economies. In other words, it's about general competitiveness. In this guise, I think it's been around, well, we could actually go back to the 17th century and mercantilism, but I want to start in the mid-19th century. The reason for starting then is that from really then on we start to get worries about relative economic decline in the UK. Now, if we were to look at the UK's rank in terms of GDP per capita amongst 16 rich countries, after the Industrial Revolution, Britain was the leader, really, but by the mid-19th century, we have Australia actually ahead, a small economy with extremely large resources. Then the US overtook the UK before World War I, and then within Europe, first Switzerland, and then after World War II, most West European countries actually caught up and overtook the UK. But then the period of relative decline really comes to an end in 1979. If we were to look at manufacturing output per worker, the trajectory is slightly different, but we have a similar story of a long lag in productivity. In the United States case, the blue line, already in the mid-19th century, the US was ahead. We could also look at Britain's share of world exports of manufacturers. This is in decline from the late 19th century, when in the 1880s it's about 43%, down to 25% by the end of the 1920s, more like under 10% by the 1970s. So let me now have a look at a brief history of UK industrial strategy through to 1979. I'm going to pick this watershed at 1979 for reasons which should now be clear. It's the end of the period of relative decline, really. Worries about national economic performance were already becoming clear after the Great Exhibition of 1851. And this led to a parliamentary report of the Committee on Manufacturing in the United States in 1855. This was followed up by the Made in Germany scare of the late 19th century, which led to a campaign for tariff reform. Excuse me. This was defeated in 1906, but revived in the interwar period and led to the general tariff of 1932. Also, many other concerns were raised during the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century about many of the 10 pillars that are discussed in the recent Green Paper on Industrial Strategy. Let me just mention a few. on skills, for example, of course, through the 19th century and the 20th century, you had the extension of compulsory education, also many inquiries into apprenticeship and technical training. On something like supporting businesses to start and grow, there were major reports on industrial finance in 1931, 1959, 1972 and 1982. In terms of driving growth across the whole economy, concerns about regional imbalances were very important in the 1930s and led to the introduction of regional policy. How successful were these policies? Well, I think it's fair to say that they have not been judged very kindly by economic historians. We've seen that relative decline, in fact, continued until the end of the 1970s. There are also some spectacularly inept policies. My favourite is the 1966 selective employment tax, which was an attempt to boost industry by taxing employment and services. There are, of course, the famous failures of many national champions. British Leyland, perhaps the most famous. There were investment decisions. Instead of investing in one satisfactory plant, the money was split between two depressed areas. The investment by the British Steel Corporation in the 1960s in plants in both Scotland and Wales is a good example of that. You had policies to encourage the dispersal of industries, most obviously the car industry being sent from Coventry, which meant a loss of economies of agglomeration. And so we come to the 1979 watershed. Now, in a way, Mrs. Thatcher didn't use the word industrial strategy. In many ways, her policy was deregulation, strengthening of competition policy, but that was an industrial strategy. It was a horizontal industrial strategy to allow the market to decide where the resources would go. Although relative decline was halted, it was not decisively reversed. But that, I think, has some implications for the Green Paper. My feeling is that the Green Paper has a striking lack of emphasis on competition. We can see why in one sense, because the Green Paper is also worried about the growing gap between the winners and losers from globalisation. But this really raises an important fundamental question. Can we improve distribution without bringing back a return to relative economic decline? And this is an important issue because of the British productivity puzzle, which is to say other countries have seen a return to productivity growth during the recovery of output since 2008. But the UK recovery has been driven more by employment than by productivity growth. You can see the flat line of the blue line here in Britain. Here's what it would have looked like if they'd continued. And over here, here's the British case again. On the other hand, Spain and the United States have been growing rapidly. Now, I think the reappearance of the British productivity puzzle brings this trade-off into sharp focus. Historically, lagging productivity growth has been addressed most successfully by policies of deregulation and competition. But many see these policies as responsible for the distributional problems that the government now wants industrial strategy to address, the regional imbalances, the personal inequality. Is this a new worry, though? Well, if we go back to the 19th century, there was an earlier era of globalization. There were similar worries that people were being left behind. At that time, we began to see the measurement of poverty by social investigators such as Booth and Rowntree. That led to the formulation of the beginnings of the welfare state. You had high unemployment rates in the 1930s, then contributing to the extension of the welfare state during and after World War II, as well as the beginnings of regional policy. Now, economic historians are normally only called upon to predict the past, which is much safer than predicting the future. But let me end with a few words on the new industrial strategy then. I'm personally wondering if industrial strategy is the best term for addressing this issue of improving national economic performance without increasing inequality. So one problem here is the association of the term industrial strategy with those pre-1979 policies to shore up inefficient manufacturing. And my worry would be that the 10 pillars of the Green Paper too often seem distorted by a desire to connect them to manufacturing. So there's a lot of emphasis on frontier research in science, but I would see a greater need for emphasis on diffusion of innovations across the whole economy, because manufacturing is a small part of the economy. In the section on skills, the emphasis seemed to be very much on STEM skills. Again, great for high-tech manufacturing, but I can't help feeling that productivity would be improved across the economy more with improvement in people skills. Going to be more widely used in services, getting people to get things done. We also have this issue of picking winners. The past doesn't seem to have been, this doesn't seem to have worked very well in the past. But that seems to be coming back here, rather than non-sector specific policies or horizontal policies. But in general, I just think we need more emphasis on services, rather that it's still, because of these older ideas of industrial strategy being tied to manufacturing, that although lip service is paid to that in the Green Paper, to shift the need for other activities, I still think the substance remains tied a bit to that older notion of industrial strategy. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Doctor.